Hi everyone, this is Randy Spivey from CPPS, and I'd like to take just a couple minutes today to talk about travel risk management and some of the things that we've seen over the last 20 years in working with large organizations on what they need to have in place, what we see they currently have in place, and that often what is the biggest gap as part of a travel risk management program. So kind of through the lens of a security executive or an organizational leadership perspective. Most organizations that have a relatively large international travel component are going to have some kind of a policy or insurance or service package with a provider that can go and do a medical evacuation if there is a problem with an employee. They get sick or they get injured, where they can go in and get them to a hospital or get them out of country relatively quickly. A lot of times they'll also have a travel intelligence provider. In other words, if they're traveling to XYZ location and they book their travel through the corporate travel department, they have a service that will send alerts or travel information based on what's going on inside the location that they're traveling to or inside the country that they're traveling to as a capability. A third item that I see lots of times is a travel tracker capability. You know, where are the employees? What countries are they in? So if there's an emergency, they're able to know, okay, how many of our employees are in the UK or how many of them, are in whatever country they're traveling to, so they can try and support them and be able to communicate with them. A lot of companies and organizations now are carrying a kidnap and ransom insurance policy, particularly if they're going to higher risk locations where criminal activity is higher than it might be in other places. And kidnapping is on the rise in certain places right now. The biggest gap that I've seen is in the individual traveler and in the training and education of that individual traveler and how to do it safely and what to do if they get into trouble. So what I mean is all travelers, really, regardless of where they're going, ought to have a baseline education and training program on the principles of safety and travel safety. For example, how do I prepare for travel? How do I check my insurance to make sure that it works into the country that I'm going to travel to? How do I register with the State Department's STEP program so that if there's an emergency while I'm in country, the State Department can get a hold of me? Things to do while they're in country. How do I pick a safe hotel? What are the rules and regulations of public transportation? Are there language issues that I need to be thinking about? When I'm walking around town, how do I determine if somebody is watching me or surveilling me? A lot of times when I'm doing the, travel safety awareness training, I'll ask everybody in the audience and I'll say, how many of you think at some point in your life you've been surveilled or just watched by somebody that had bad intent or criminal intent, whether they targeted you or not? And typically I'll have about half the people raise their hands. Well, I then counter and say, I would suggest you've all been watched. Whether you're at an amusement park, you're at the county fair, you're at the mall, there are people out there with criminal intent. And most of the times they are going to watch people before they actually commit the crime itself. Maybe for a few seconds, it could be for a much longer period of time, but they're watching you. So that makes it important to be able to determine if they're watching you, how do you pick it up? And if you don't pick it up, how do you do the next basic principle? And that is be situationally aware of what's going on around you and make yourself a hard target versus soft target. It's amazing how many people just walking around town make themselves vulnerable because they're not paying attention to their surroundings. And so providing basic information on how people can make themselves a hard target, don't be by yourself, be paying attention to what's going on around you. Don't be distracted by, your phone or your in your own world because you're just paying attention to your text messaging and going back and forth on your phone. And that lack of awareness can make you a vulnerable target. And then it's important to give people at least a basic understanding of how to respond in an emergency. Whether it's a natural disaster, whether it is political unrest, whether it is somebody gets kidnapped. They'll have a kidnap and ransom insurance policy, but the individual traveler has not been trained on how they would respond or should respond if they ever find themselves in a hostage situation or in an express kidnapping, for example. There have been people who lost their lives because they did the wrong thing when really all the people that were grabbing them wanted a couple $100 out of the ATM. So having a basic understanding of things along the lines of a kidnapping is important. What to do if you're detained by a foreign government, like we saw with Brittany Griner here in Russia not too long ago. What do you say when you're being detained? How do you respond if you say the wrong thing as you're going through customs? How do you interface with the embassy? What can the embassy do and what can they not do? All of those kind of concepts would be packaged in a basic program on travel safety. But the reality is, from what I've seen, most organizations, they have the infrastructure, but they don't have the training. And the people are going out there and they're the weakest link in the entire TRM program. You think about workplace violence, and more organizations are putting together good workplace violence prevention programs. But if you think about it, when we talk about what is the workplace, am I working from home? Am I in the company office? Or am I traveling to another location outside your country on behalf of the company? Well, if you are traveling and you're doing work on behalf of the company, really that workplace now becomes where you're traveling to and when you're traveling itself. And so I think it's a reasonable argument to make that, the workplace violence prevention program actually has to include education and training on how to prepare that individual to travel safely and what to do if they get into harm's way. It's kind of like prevention and response. We're going to prevent violence in the workplace, and then violence breaks out. I'm trained in active shooter, active surveillance, survival. Well, same thing when you're traveling. How do I travel safely? And then what do I do? How do I respond if I get in a crisis? So I think saying it's part of a holistic workplace violence prevention is not that big of a stretch. And then the final thing that I would comment on is based on the risk factors of the individual that's doing the travel on behalf of the organization. And most organizations, they stratify risk based on where they're traveling to. I would argue that there are a couple of other factors when we determine the risk of the individual that's traveling beyond just where they're traveling, but who are they within the organization? Are they a purchaser for the organization? Are they logistics? Are they a senior executive within the company? That can affect risk. And then the other one is, what are they going to do where they're traveling to? Some organizations send individuals out there in countries and in cities where the people that know indigenous folks that know what they're doing and they don't like it. And so the risk factors can actually be increased if you're doing things that the people that live where you're traveling to are real pleased with. But the primary one in determining is where it is they're traveling to. How high is the crime rate? Is it known to be a lot of kidnappings taking place? Are there tensions between our government, i.e. Russia and the United States right now? Those all affect the risk of being detained or kidnapped. So you want to be able to identify what is our risk. Is it low? Is it medium? Is it high? And a lot of times organizations, they need to send people to places that are high risk. And our suggestion as far as that travel risk management program is that if you have to do that, and that's part of the business model, then make sure that they're trained and equipped accordingly. So in other words, a video or an e-learning course might, 25, 30 minutes, that might be your baseline awareness training. But then, if you're going to a moderate or high risk location, you might need to spend several hours with them, really explain some of the nuances of being detained by a government or how to respond in various types of crises and keep them safe to begin with. So that immersion level training or more experiential based training, particularly if they go into real high risk locations, they'll not only be better prepared with the information, they'll be able to retain it more, particularly if it has some kind of a tabletop or a role play environment to that, to where they have to practice it rather than just a PowerPoint slide presentation or an e-learning course. Nothing wrong with that for the awareness training, but if they're really traveling to high-risk locations, they really should get more in-depth content and the ability to utilize it and use it. And what we find is that not only do they increase their resiliency and ability to protect themselves, but it reduces anxiety for them because they've wondered in the back of their head, what would I do if, and now I have information. In fact, it's not uncommon for us to have somebody that travels regularly to high-risk locations, that after they go through that more in-depth training, they say to us, I can't believe I've been traveling where I've been traveling as long as I've been traveling there without knowing this core content. And so we see those as gaps in travel risk management programs, and we're designed to be able to help fill in those gaps, whether they're traveling to very high-risk locations or just needing that awareness training. We produced a new e-learning course on travel safety principles, and just released it a couple of weeks ago. So if you want more information on any of those, get a hold of us at info@cpps.com, and we wish you all safe travels.